So let's go on to our first song, our first hip-hop song. We're going to be looking at and listening to a hip-hop artist. His name is Outspoken, and he is from Zimbabwe. And his music, or this particular piece, is called Freedom Train, and he talks about democracy and human rights in Zimbabwe. So let's go on to that.
Yo, this is Outspoken Alpha Intellect straight out of Zimbabwe. And this piece is entitled The Freedom Train, which is a depiction of how we move from slavery, being colonized, to a state of freedom that really wasn't achieved. And it's a journey, a process, symbolized by the railroad, the continuous rail. Still inside the station waiting on the Freedom Train, its inspector came to check on our tickets if we had paid. Finally my people shall be home amongst their relatives and peers. They could hardly wait to see the city's horizon disappear into the distance. It was one train with many classes. The luxurious was the first. Then came the second-class citizen. Then the economy. That is the worst. Not because of its occupants, but mainly their conditions, where they were packed like animals, sweating like the steam engines. All aboard! That was freedom's last call. The destination was democracy, equality for all but a few. The few being the masses, and the last that were disposable to benefit the upper class. Tickets. Tickets, please. Amayu did not pay. You think you're gonna get a free ride in the Freedom Train? He can clearly see she is sick and in need of urgent assistance. Amai, I'm not a doctor. All I want from you is a ticket. So another passenger dies, for she could not afford the medication of her ailments. So she succumbed to her sores. Across the masses gathered was the hovering of pain. Another one of us departed from the Freedom Train. Mountains rolled and valleys passed, the few that had the view aboard this runaway train of passengers without a crew but the inspector. They huddled, praying justice would prevail, but lived within the laws of physics, so they were destined to derail. A pregnant mother squirmed as her water broke in panic. Hope was her unborn daughter, but her birth was none but tragic. She only saw the light of day minutes before the crash sucked back into a darkness with radiance everlasting. If only the inspector started checking on the drivers, there wouldn't be this ugly scene of checking on survivors. 18 April 1980 was the day we left the station aboard the Freedom Train, but still haven't reached our destination, freedom.
Okay. What do you think? Pretty powerful, eh? What do you think? Any reactions? No? What did he say about human rights and democracy?
Every weekend there were classes. There were a lot of kidnapping, flying into our country to get anything and everything, from clothing, from food, from basically everything. All the clothes, from the empty. The living condition is bad. And those who get into it, that's how it goes. And then hope.
So yeah, but what you're saying is that you're agreeing with what he's saying, his assessment, right? Without human rights, there's no freedom, and that that independence that was gained in 1980 is very shaky at best in terms of how people are living in Zimbabwe today. What about the connections between human rights and democracy? Did you find anything interesting there? Yes?
I just feel like he was just basically saying that even though they were technically a democratic country, they still didn't have the freedom that was supposed to come with democracy. Like, it's not there. It's not
right. So that we can talk about human rights and we can talk about freedom, but we need democracy and maybe human rights as well. Yep.
Yeah, I really like the line where it's saying freedom for all of the few. So, and how we talked about basically the upper class who gets to go and who gets to ride in certain things, gets to benefit from what little human rights are available, or so it's like, at best in that situation, the only people who are getting freedom are upper class, and most people are not.
Right. So now there's a class system, right? There's a class system as the society is disintegrating in a sense. The class system comes to the fore even more powerfully. Saw a hand over here. Yes. Tell us your name. You are from Zimbabwe. Yes.
The democracy thing needs independence, but people, you can't say what there are no human rights. You get beaten up sometimes in elections if you don't vote for the party that most of the people want to vote. For the opposition, it's kind of scary. There's democracy, but human rights are not there.
Okay. So we might have democracy, we might be able to vote, but we might not have freedom to speak out. And that's what human rights might allow us, or at least support us in doing. Yeah? Those are all really good points. And as they came out, you see the interconnections between human rights and democracy. Simply having democracy doesn't mean that your basic human rights are ensured. But without democracy, human rights, it's difficult for human rights to flourish, right? When we're talking about things like democracy and human rights, the first thing we should really think about is, what does it mean, right? When we're talking about democracy in this class, what are we going to mean by that? And what I'm going to propose is that we use a very simple definition. In your political theory classes and your politics classes, you will go into much more nuance on what this all means. But this is a law class. So what we're going to do is take a very simple definition of democracy. Would anybody like to propose one? Yes.
Matt, I'm working with Jonathan.
And, sorry?
My name is Matt from Calgary.
Excellent. Hi, Matt.
So democracy is a system of government in which the government represents the people and stands for their interests as opposed to opposing the people and standing for the interests of the government.
Fantastic, Matt. You could have written my next slide. Government by the people. We're just going to keep it very, very simple. Government by the people. What about human rights? Anybody want to suggest a definition for human rights? It's a little trickier. Yes?
The rights which all humans should be entitled to, or the things and I guess not ideas, but rights.
Rights, yep. No, the rights, duties, obligations that all humans are equally that we all equally have, essentially. Yep.
I think it's like the natural standards of life in which all humans are entitled by birth.
Okay. Sarah has more of a naturalist perspective on it. Excellent. Also very good. Here's what I'm going to propose. Oh, a preamble to the UDHR. Not quite yet. I'm going to say that human rights refer to universal rights that apply to individuals in all societies. Yeah? And it came out of, very much came out of, the horrors of World War II. After the world realized and understood what had happened in the concentration camps, we were aghast at the amount of suffering and torture that had happened during those years. And it really forced everyone to reassess what they thought was most important. Now, this had been ongoing before the United Nations was created, and we'll learn about that in a few weeks. But this was certainly, 1945 to 50 was a time when we really went through a reevaluation of values. And so that's when the Universal Declaration was crafted. And so human rights, the idea is that we have recourse to something outside of our state, right, that gives us power, essentially, that allows us to stand on equal footing with each other and against certain forms of power and tyranny, right? Yes, human rights and democracy are intricately linked. Human rights lead to freedom from fear, but also allow freedom to act, right? And so we see that democracy is also about freedoms, right? So we're going to see eventually that the two have very similar goals. On one hand, we have human rights. On the other hand, we in Canada have a liberal democracy, right? And we can start to see where some of the overlaps happen. So we have democracy. In Canada, we value liberty and equality, right? We have human rights. We have civil rights. We have political rights. We have economic rights. We have social and cultural rights. We have all kinds of rights in Canada, right? But these are meant to empower, right? But this is also meant to empower. This is also meant to empower, right? This is meant to provide, obviously, security. This is meant to provide security, right? Guaranteeing these freedoms means security. But equality can also mean a form of security, right? So we see, in fact, that democracy and human rights are linked in terms of the goals, some of the goals, not all of them, some of them, and sometimes their process and method, depending on the moment. Just like Outspoken said, human rights without democracy and democracy without human rights is a system that can fall apart, and certainly is falling apart, according to him, in Zimbabwe.